Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our talk this morning. This is Calculating Risk in the Era of Obscurity, reading between the lines of security advisories. Like I said, my name is Brian Gorenc. I'm the Senior Director of Vulnerability Research at Trend Micro. I also run the Zero Day Initiative, which represents the world's largest vendor-agnostic bug bounty program. And we also organize and adjudicate the Pwn2Own hacking contest. With me today is Dustin Childs, our Senior Communications Manager with ZDI, and he's also our Chief Patch Wrangler. We're here today to talk about the security of patches themselves and how current vendor practices inevitably are creating risk for enterprises rather than lowering risks through software updates. I'm going to hand it over to Dustin, and he'll begin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dustin, and I care far too much about security patches. It's actually kind of a sickness with me. You've probably heard of Patch Tuesday. Since January of 2008, I have worked every single Patch Tuesday except for two. One was for federal jury duty. The other was my sister's wedding. And weirdly enough, neither one would move the date for me. So why do I care so much? It's because study after study after study has shown that applying patches is one of the best things you can do to help protect your enterprise and reduce the risk of incidents and breaches. And in a former life, I worked at Microsoft and in the MSRC and helped produce the patches, which means I rebooted your computer at some point. My bad. Just want to apologize right now to your face. And today, I write a monthly patch blog talking about the latest updates from Adobe and Microsoft. And here at the ZDI, we have a unique view into how different vendors across various sectors of IT develop and produce patches. Since 2005, we have disclosed more than 10,000 vulnerabilities to vendors across the industry, so we speak from vast experience when it comes to bug disclosure. And over the last few years, we've noticed a disturbing trend, which is a decrease in patch quality and a reduction of communications surrounding security updates. Now, if you're in this room, you probably already know why patching is important, and I'm not going to insult you by saying just patch it. We know that's not always feasible. I also know that estimating risk is one of the primary roles of CSOs, CISOs, and IT leadership. The real problem arises when vendors release faulty patches. Now, as we'll demonstrate in this talk, inaccurate or incomplete information about those patches can cause enterprises to miscalculate risk. Faulty patches can also be a boon to exploit writers, as end days are much easier to use than 0 days. Look, bugs are hard to find, unless it's the second Tuesday of the month, and then Microsoft says, here's 120, and Adobe says, here's 50. You know, that's good. It's to the point where enterprises have begun on relying on third parties or developing their own patching priorities rather than relying on vendor recommendations or other industry standards. Look, folks, I know it. We are all the three unders. We're understaffed, we're underfunded, and under pressure, right? So a misallocation of resources could result in increased risk and an increased chance of compromise. So let's begin by talking about how enterprises calculate risk and some issues with security patches have that can lead to miscalculations. Now, this is not going to be a talk of whether CVSS is or is not a great tool. That's a different talk. However, too often, enterprises look no further than the CVSS base score to determine patching priority. This can lead to resources being spent on bugs that are unlikely to ever be exploited. To begin with, CVSS is calculated by humans who are known to have biases, and they take those biases with them wherever they go. So this leads to differences of how vendors perceive risk versus the actual attack surface of a product when it's really deployed. And that could adjust the CVSS score up or down. For example, an Amazon Linux bug was rated at a 9.8. So it could expose sensitive data in an HTTP header to unintended host. However, based on real-world factors, Tenable rated it at 5.9. So who's correct? Which one do you act on? I don't actually know that one. Another problem is that CVSS doesn't really look at exploitability or whether a vulnerability is likely to be used in the wild. And research conducted by the Sensia Institute, the RAND Institute, and Virginia Tech has shown that only 5.5% of disclosed vulnerabilities are ever actually detected in the wild. The QR code leads to that study. The CVSS doesn't tell you if the bug exists in 15 systems or in 15 million systems. And it doesn't say whether or not it's in a publicly accessible server. And most importantly to this crowd, it doesn't say whether or not the bug is present in a system that's critical to your enterprise. And finally, every CVSS 10 is not a CVSS 10. A remote unauthenticated code execution bug in an email server like XM or Exchange is going to generate a lot of interest, especially from exploit writers. However, a remote unauthenticated code execution bug in an email server like Squirrel Mail is probably not going to generate as much attention. Please note that this is not an endorsement of Squirrel Mail. The security through Obscurity is still bad. At the ZDI, we see another problem, and that's vendors combining multiple bug reports into a single CVE. However, the common perception is that CVE represents a single, unique vulnerability. Now, that may not be the way CVE rules are written, but that perception exists. And really, what's the problem? If you've got 10 oob-writes or UAFs or deserialization bugs, why shouldn't you combine them into a single bug report, to a single CVE? Well, again, it comes down to perception, which leads to possibly skewing your risk calculation. So if you look at a product and you see 10 CVEs that are patched in a certain amount of time, you may come up with one conclusion of the risk calculation from this new product. However, if you knew those 10 CVEs were based on 100+ bug reports, you might come to a different conclusion. And really, it boils down to enterprises miscalculating the severity of a CVE because they don't have the tools to understand the density of the code problem. So here's an example. Earlier this year, we bought 4 out of many SAP bugs, 1 oob read and 3 oob writes, and reported it to them. When SAP patched them, they assigned it this one single CVE. So if you look at their website, if you could find it, it's a little hard to navigate their website. You'll find this single CVE for these reports. But if you look at our website, you'll see these 4 bug reports for that single CVE. And your risk calculation may change based on this knowledge. At the very least, it's another data point for you to consider. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention ICS cert as the ICS and SCADA community is the worst offender, best examples of this practice. It's incredibly common for us to report dozens of bugs that end up being combined. In a recent disclosure, we disclosed more than 50 bugs to Advantech, mostly SQL injections. They patched them in batches, which makes sense, but those 50+ reports ended up as 3 unique CVEs. And then there's obscuring or flat out removing information from security advisories. In late 2020, Microsoft made the decision to remove the executive summary from its security update guide, informing users that CVSS would be sufficient. Now, in ignoring all the problems we've already talked about in CVS already, the change removes context from bugs that's needed to determine risk. For example, does an information disclosure bug dump random memory or PII? CVSS doesn't note that. For security feature bypass, what is being bypassed and what's the likelihood? CVSS doesn't note that. There's also an interesting situation where the CVSS score doesn't align completely with the Microsoft rating system of critical important severity. So for example, last Tuesday, they had an important severity bug with the CVSS of 9.8, which MITRE says is critical. Now, if you're only deploying critical bugs first, which one do you pay attention to? They're both from Microsoft, so they both should be authoritative. Now, some information has begun to return to these write-ups, but it's inconsistent and of varying quality, despite near universal criticism of the change. And here's an example. This is an executive summary from a DNS bug back in 2020. And I cut it off intentionally because we really don't need to examine what the bug is. But here's a DNS bug from 2022. That's it. But really, this change comes after years of Microsoft either removing or obscuring information about their updates. They used to produce clear guidance telling admins how many bugs were patched each month. Now you have to count yourself. That's actually one of the hardest things I do for my blog, is just count how many CVEs. You'd be surprised how many times I get it wrong. I even take off my socks and count on my toes, too. They used to tell you very clearly how many bugs were under active attack or publicly known. That's one of the first things enterprises look for. Information is still available, yes, but it's buried deep in the bulletins now. And with 121 CVEs being patched this month, it's kind of hard to dig through all of them to look for which ones are under active attack. Instead, people now rely on other sources of information, my blog, other blogs, and press articles, rather than what should be authoritative information from the vendor to help determine risk. And look, Microsoft is hardly alone in this. I'm not here just to bash them. Many vendors don't even provide CVEs when they release an update. They just say, fixes several security issues. How many? What's the severity? What's the exploitability? They provide no context at all. We even had a vendor recently state to us specifically, we do not publish public advisories on security issues. That's a bold move, Cotton. We'll see how that works out for them. Some vendors put advisories behind paywalls or support contracts, further obscuring their risk from potential customers. and rarely does any vendor actually provide any guidance on exploitability. And in one sense, this is understandable because defining exploitability is really hard. However, understanding exploitability is a key component to estimating risk from a bug. What are the chances this severe-sounding bug actually gets exploited in the wild? High? Low? Do I need to engage emergency resources to deploy this patch, or will my normal procedures suffice? See, the push towards patch automation has removed the ability of many enterprises to judge the risk to their systems. Consequently, enterprises now must invest in third-party tools, not just for patch management, but for patch prioritization. The push for API-driven vulnerability reporting has resulted in all bugs looking nearly identical on paper, but all bugs are not created equal. To misquote Syndrome, if all bugs are special, then no bugs are special. So we as an industry must take a close look at the results of the API-driven vulnerability reporting model and ask ourselves if it's serving its purpose, or has the quest for automation left us in a worse state than we were before? But beyond just the way the patches are communicated, let's talk about some problems with the patches themselves. The worst case scenario is what we call a placebo patch. That's when a patch is released from a vendor that either makes no code changes at all or makes no effective code changes and the bug is still reachable. Either way, that bug is still there and exploitable to threat actors, except now they've been informed of it. And if you think we're joking about patches that make no changes at all, sadly we're not, and it's not just one vendor. There are many reasons why it could happen, but it happens. And this is hardly new. We've been actually talking about this at the ZDI for years, as in bugs so nice we patched them twice. That's a different talk as well. You can hit that QR code to see the YouTube video of it. But here's a recent example in Advantech Web Access, which is a popular SCADA product. According to their website, it provides users with a cross-platform, cross-browser data access experience and a user interface based on HTML5 technology. Neat. So we purchased a directory traversal bug that could lead to code execution. The root cause was the implementation of the 2711 ioctl in the web services process. After it was patched, the researcher submitted another bug bypassing that, and it was a directory traversal bug that could lead to code execution, and the problem was due to the implementation of the 2711 ioctl in the web services process. After that patch was released, a ZDI analyst found no code changes in the patch at all. So again, we reported a directory traversal bug that could lead to code execution due to the implementation of the 2711 ioctl in the web services process. At least we didn't have to buy the third bug. It was one of our analysts who found it. And while this is embarrassing for the vendor, enterprises are suffering real consequences from this. So for one, we know that patches are reversed and become exploits. So a placebo patch notifies the threat actors of the bug, while enterprises are left in a state more vulnerable than they were before before the patch didn't exist, because they don't have defenses to adequately defend themselves. Enterprises must also spend resources to deploy patches. And whatever calculus you use that says the cost of deploying a patch, if it takes 3 times to do it, that's 3 times the cost. I'm not a genius in math, but 3 is greater than 1. I learned that somewhere. So their bad patches are costing you real money, even if it never gets exploited. Then there's often patches that will break just a point fix or proof of concept code. This is an example from Adobe Acrobat. And we don't need to delve too much into the super technical here. Just know that the value we set for an array is extremely large and ends up resulting in an integer overflow, leading to an undersized heap allocation, which results in a buffer overflow when data is written there. In other words, open PDF get owned. We expected Adobe to make the fix by setting any value over a certain point to be bad, but that's not what we saw. This is the proof of concept that the researcher submitted to us. It was pretty good. So good, in fact, that Adobe just pretty much took it and dropped it into its patch, looking for that specific value. Now, the researcher also noticed this, and within an hour of the patch being made public, yes, within 60 minutes, they said, hey, we bypassed the patch. Here's our new POC, so we bought this bug. Can you spot the difference? Can you spot it now? Yep, they just changed the value of the specified array and re-triggered the overflow, resulting in code execution again. The final patch introduced math to calculate whether the specified array length was actually a valid value. That one worked. But reruns aren't just for TV shows. They happen in security patches as well. Case in point, Microsoft SharePoint. These always start with a vendor shipping a bug, and I want to thank them for that. I've been gainfully employed my adult life due to vendors shipping bugs. I appreciate that. In this case, a researcher discovered a bug in a remote code execution bug in all supported versions of SharePoint and sold that bug to us. We reported it to Microsoft the next day. We have a 120-day disclosure timeline, and they took nearly all of that to produce their first version of this fix on February 12th. Now, I blog a lot, and I blog a lot about really cool bugs, and this was a really cool bug. So I'd worked with the anonymous researcher to produce a blog on this on Patch Tuesday. And my mouse was literally moving over to the button to hit publish when I received a panicked email from the researcher saying, don't publish the blog. The patch can be easily circumvented. So we purchased the bug again and reported the patch circumvention to Microsoft. They released their version 2 of the patch 28 days later. We took 24 hours to actually look at the patch this time, so I didn't publish something too bad, pushed our blog out. Now again, like I said, this is a really cool bug, so we knew in all likelihood active attacks were coming, and we detected them 42 days after that. Now the problem here is if you only had revision 1.0 of this update, you are not fully protected from that active attack. By the way, this was the active attack that was used against the United Nations as well. And interestingly enough, after the active attacks were discovered, revision 3.0 went out. Now, lest you think we're just here to talk bad about other people, let's talk about a bug in Trend Micro Apex 1. And yes, that is a Trend Micro logo on my sleeve. Curate ipsum, as it were, physician, heal thyself. So we bought a privilege escalation bug in our Apex 1 endpoint security product due to incorrect permissions, and it was resolved by this CVE. After that patch was released, the researcher reported a privilege escalation bug that was due to incorrect permissions. He bypassed the patch pretty easily, and it was addressed by this CVE. Now, if you've been paying attention and noticed the empty space on the slide, you can probably predict what's coming next. That's right. He sold us a third privilege escalation bug that bypassed the CVE due to a permissions issue. And we patched it with the CVE. Now, for us, this wasn't the worst case scenario because we took this as a case study to our developers and said, look, here's how we can work together to develop more comprehensive patches. So hopefully we see less of this in the future. Any other examples, Dustin? Why, yes, I have receipts. There are quite a few other examples, and unfortunately, it's only a 40-minute talk. But this is just a small sampling of other CVEs that were incomplete or otherwise faulty, and each one of these represents so many more. In fact, right now, in our program, 10 to 20% of the bugs we are purchasing are the direct result from a faulty or incomplete patch. And if that Microsoft CVE looks familiar to you, that is the one that was patched in July that, according to Microsoft, was being used by Austrian threat actors to spread Sub-Zero malware. Within a day or two of the patch being released, one of our researchers, Simon Zuckerbrand, was able to bypass that patch and continue exploitation. In fact, he bypassed about 10% of the last patch.
Yep, correct.
Yeah. Simon's an awesome guy. Frightening. Awesome. So we have reported that to Microsoft and are awaiting things. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Brian. He's going to talk about the industry of patching.
Yes. Now, luckily for us, patching creates jobs, right? We've all had jobs in this industry now for a long time because patches are happening, vulnerabilities are being discovered. But unknown to most, there's actually a cottage industry around actually analyzing and reversing and weaponizing patches. And part of the reason this industry actually exists and is able to function is due to the intermittent quality of the actual security updates themselves. So let's take a peek at this industry and show you how it can actually impact the risk to the enterprise itself. Now, like we said, there are several different areas where people are looking at patches, and the first one we want to talk about is obviously the third-party patch management groups out there. Companies like ManageEngine, Avanti, QuestCase, and many others provide tools that actually help enterprises manage their patch deployments. They're looking at the patch releases, trying to make sure that you're able to deploy those patches out into the enterprise, but they're not going very deep into the actual patch itself. Then there's groups out there that produce end-to-end analysis of patches, meaning they reverse engineer the updates for the development of threat intelligence as a service. We do that at Trend Micro. We reverse engineer a lot of the patches that come out. In fact, we have an entire team that does just that. Companies like Exodus and Flexera, formerly Secunia, to some extent do that type of work as well. Of course, there's the pen test and red team communities that are looking at the patches so that they can actually develop proof of concepts and exploits that they can integrate into their tooling so enterprises can actually test the actual patches themselves once they're deployed. So when you're talking about building Metasploit modules, updating Canvas, and likewise, these companies are trying to integrate the latest bugs into their tools. And rightfully so, because these folks are doing it as well, the criminal element. They're working to add the bugs into their BEC tool chains, their ransomware, their exploit kits. And though it is uncommon that ransomware uses zero-day vulnerabilities, for the most part, they're using end-day vulnerabilities that have public patches available. And we actually saw this in the offensive community back when the hacking team breaches occurred several years ago. There was several email chains in there talking about which patches were coming out, which vendors were not good at actually patching so that they could monitor what's going to happen and redevelop tooling to actually release their exploit kit. Now, when we discuss timelines, people most often talk about the time to fix. They are looking for when the bug was reported to the vendor and how long it took them to actually fix that and resolve the issue. And of course, this absolutely matters, but this is not the only timeline to consider. The first other timeline to consider is the time to patch. How long does it take you to actually roll out the patches in your enterprise? And are you sure that you're actually able to roll them out to your entire enterprise? Can you do it faster than the reverse engineers out there who are working to analyze that patch and develop an exploit? And are you sure that you can actually beat them in this process? From the time from patch to when it can actually turn into an exploit, it can be as little as 48 hours. And we'll actually talk about a case study here in a second about that. However, when analyzing patches, little effort is given to the actual estimate of time to exploit, as it's always going to be an estimate. But since we know that we're all resource constrained, how important would it be for us to understand if that bug was actually going to be weaponized? Now, most vendors do not provide information regarding exploitability. Microsoft actually attempted to solve this problem with their exploit index, but this is no longer really useful thanks to cumulative updates. Originally, XI was intended to help system administrators prioritize which patches to test and deploy first. The thought was that you would prioritize an important class bug that was likely to be exploited over a critical class bug that was less likely to be exploited. But since that time, security patches are actually become cumulative. And today, it's rare that you're going to apply one patch to one component. You are going to apply a monthly roll-up of fixes for many CVEs. Therefore, when you have to treat all bugs in an update as though they're the highest XI rating bug for any single bug in that update. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to call out XI1 when the whole update should be treated as XI1 if there's only one in there. The reality is risk assessments are going to change post-release. A bug that was not priority can become high priority quickly when integrated into an exploit kit or ransomware or when an exploit is released online. Enterprises should be looking at patches beyond Patch Tuesday, as we've seen in the previous slide, to ensure that resources are still properly aligned for the prevalent risk. When changes occur to the threat landscape, enterprises should be shifting their resources to meet the need and combat the latest risks, not just the latest publicized and named vulnerability. As again, patch management and risk calculation should be an OODA loop, where you're actually observing what's going on in the threat landscape, orienting your resources, and deciding and acting on when to deploy that. Now, like we talked about, the time to exploit is actually decreasing a lot. And here's a case study of that from our recent Pwn to Own contest. If you don't know what Pwn to Own is, it's a hacking competition that we run 3 times a year. And in the spring event, we typically hold it in Vancouver. It focuses on enterprise tools and applications, including web browsers. In Pwn to Own 2021, there was a special bonus for an attack that could take advantage of both Chrome and Edge, Edge browsers in a single exploit. We did that because both of those browsers are actually based off of the Chromium source code, and we just thought it would be cool to see an exploit that would work on both. Yeah. And so that's why we did it. And actually, one team was able to achieve that. But an interesting situation occurred after this bug was reported to the vendor, in this case, Google. So of course, with everything in this world, it all starts with bugs and vendors shipping a bug. So thank you very much for keeping us employed. During Pwn to Own, a team of Bruno Keith and Nicholas Bumstart from Dataflow Security used a typer mismatch bug to actually exploit the Chrome renderer process and Microsoft Edge at the same time using the same exploit. Very cool stuff. Worked right out of the box. Their successful demonstration earned them $100,000 at the contest. And since it's Pwn to Own, We give the bug and the information to Google, the Google team immediately so that they can actually start working on the fix. Now, the fix was checked into the open source V8 JavaScript engine source code repository, but it had not been integrated into the official downstream Chromium-based browsers at that point. That was planned for a couple days later. And before that integration could occur, a security researcher was able to reverse engineer the code fix that the Chromium team had pushed in that open source component. And he used that information to actually build and publish an exploit and released it on GitHub, effectively ODaying that bug before the integration could actually happen. Very quickly. It was awesome, actually, to be honest. The Google team then released their patch on April 13th, and Microsoft released theirs. They consumed that fix a couple days later. But other Chromium-based web applications are still vulnerable if they haven't consumed that upstream fix. And I will say now on this stage that the patch gap problem for integrated Chromium applications is significant. Even from Foxit PDF Reader to every single smart television out there, to web-enabled speakers, to home automation devices, even to automobiles. The list goes on and on and on. But that's a different talk. And of course, because we know about this, we've actually had to remove smart televisions from Pwn to Own because we were getting a ton of submissions just using end-day Chromium bug exploit chains. Now, different verticals are going to take different approaches on how they actually handle patches themselves. And these differences do matter to the end user. There are those who are out there who follow the traditional Patch Tuesday style releases, even if they don't occur on Patch Tuesday. Companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, Cisco, and to some extent Apple, this predictive disclosure allows people to plan around the patch releases themselves. And then there are those who take a more agile approach. In these cases, they're focusing on rapid releases as needed. They have minimal documentation and release notes, very little integration testing. Things like cloud technology, some Google technologies fall into this category. This allows companies to obviously react faster to the dynamic risks of their environment, but it's unpredictable for users when that update is actually going to come. You've seen it sometimes on stages like here at Black Hat, where an update will pop up during the middle of the talk. Then there are those who roll out their patches over the air, where vendors are shipping the patches to mobile phones or cars. These are the types of devices that come to mind. Often, they roll out on a per-region basis. So you might not receive your actual update depending on your geographical location. And you can end up being vulnerable to publicly disclosed bugs, even though you think you're updated. This is often hard to tell, since they do even less documentation and essentially remove the user control from the equation. And in fact, this happens to us every time we do our fall Pwn to Own event, because we're purchasing IoT. The event focuses on IoT and mobile devices, and we buy devices from all over the world. And depending on which region we buy them, they have different updates, and it actually is very challenging to get those devices up to the latest patch levels. Then there's the ICS community. For these vendors, they often focus on customer deployment first and do public disclosure later, and even if they disclose at all. Much of the documentation is actually behind paywalls. After all, this is an industry that considers a license agreement a defense in depth measure, and that's not a joke. While this method may work for vendors, it removes the value of the CVE from the equation because there's no actual public coordination going on. And then we get to one of the most difficult disclosure situations that we have to deal with, the dreaded multi-vendor vulnerability disclosure. Last fall at Pwn to Own Austin, a bug was demonstrated in a Western Digital NAS device. When we received the report from them, it was determined that the cause of the bug itself was in an open source product called Netatalk library, which is a core component that is used in lots of NAS devices and lots of other devices to provide Apple file sharing. Now, when we disclosed this bug to Western Digital, they engaged CertCC, rightfully so, to help with the notification and response process. Once the library maintainer actually released the fix, which took some time because that library is actually no longer maintained, they published the update. But then it has to be consumed with all the different vendors who actually use that fix. And in this case, there was actually 200 different vendors on that disclosure thread trying to make sure that they were going to integrate their Netatalk library in their product. So should all the vendors actually have to wait for disclosure when everybody is fixed? Because that would effectively make a situation where one vendor could hold up the other vendors from releasing their fixes in their products. Instead, vendors are often left rushing to integrate the fix. Some are late, and you end up in the situation where the fix is available, but maybe your vendor hasn't integrated the fix into their product, creating a significant patch gap. Misunderstanding of the supply chain risk to some system integrators leads to slow patch integration as new affected systems are identified, and if the maintainer isn't aware of their software bill of materials, the fix may not come at all. In this specific instance, Western Digital simply removed the library from their products. However, other vendors like Synology and QNAP ended up exposed to multiple network-based code execution vulnerabilities with known public exploits. Now, when patches are released, it shines a spotlight on a component. It's like ringing the dinner bell, saying, hey, everyone, there's a bug over here in this attack surface that you may have never thought of. Or there's a new exploit technique that can be used in other products. Or there's an existence of buggy code that is shared across an entire product line. But that's a different talk. We tend to think risks go down when the patch is actually released, but in many cases, the risk actually increases when the patch is released. It lets the attacker know that there's problems in this area that can be exploited. As we've seen before, there are studies out there from the NSA and others that attacks do start within 48 hours of the patch release. And that's assumed that the patch actually is complete to begin with. Enterprises can end up with a false sense of security if they believe that they've mitigated the risk by applying the patch, but instead the patch is incomplete and you're still at risk, or it's shared between multiple vendors and the patch is only available for some. And of course, Log4j was an excellent example of this. This bug existed since 2013, and it wasn't disclosed until December 2021. And here we are, 8 months later, still finding vulnerable Log4j instances out there, still finding bugs with unpatched Log4j components. And yes, that is the real Log4Shell logo, which is fantastic. It looks great. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dustin, who will talk about determining risk and demanding improvements.
So once we get to this and we understand this, the first question we usually get asked is, why is this happening? There are many reasons. But really, it boils down to a few specific points that we've identified. And for many, it's a focus away from sustained engineering towards product development. Vendors are rushing to ship and close bug reports or fail to properly test them prior to release. In a lot of cases, they just aren't resourced appropriately to create comprehensive fixes for the reported vulnerabilities. There is simple human error. People do make mistakes, and those mistakes do end up in patches. However, there's also a skill gap in testing and QA. Partially because the industry has really disinvested in maintaining testers. One of the first things Satya Nadella did as Microsoft CEO was to eliminate many QA positions, stating it often makes sense to have the developers test and fix bugs instead of a separate team of testers. And many others have followed his lead and either reduced QA or passed the burden on to developers. As a result, the security expertise that existed in organizations has moved on to other areas, helping widen that skills gap rather than shrink it. And finally, vendors see no benefit from being transparent when it comes to their communications and about the security of their product, and whether it be no communication or misleading or incomplete communication, they simply don't see the return on investment. They want us to just trust them. Just trust us. It's hard to do when they're not being very trustworthy. So what, as enterprises should take away from this is first understand that due to flawed vendor practices, enterprises no longer have a clear view of the true risk to their networks. Whether it's issues in CVSS ratings or manipulating CVE to disguise risk or a lack of clear vendor guidance, enterprises really no longer have an easy method to quantify the risk to their systems. Patches that are faulty or otherwise incomplete are costing you real money. And it's not just with the new patches that are getting rolled out. Enterprises need to spend their already limited resources redeploying patches they have already installed. And enterprises ended up spending money instead on third-party and other tools just to handle the occasional nightmare that is patch management. And most notably, there are many times when a patch increases rather than decreases risk. The time to exploit counter is often far less than time to deploy, even if you're a very mature and well-disciplined enterprise. And an incomplete patch just tells the attackers where the bug is without giving the defender the tools they need to prevent their exploitation. So what can we do? What can you do to help from this is to first of all understand what you have to defend, and I truly mean this, is be ruthless in your asset discovery. When it comes to passive fingerprinting and network detection, you have to know what you have to protect, and you have to know how to segregate it. And if you're developing a product, make sure you understand your software bill of materials and ensure updates are integrated. Second of all, you might not feel like you have a loud voice in your discussion, but your wallet speaks loudly on your behalf. Now, I do not expect people with E5 licenses to just ditch Microsoft for Linux because of a bad patch. However, it does give you an avenue for feedback to your vendors. And especially when deciding on new vendors, include in your RFPs, what is your patching policy? What do your security advisories look like? That sort of thing. You'd be surprised the answers you do and do not get. And finally, understand that your risk management from security patches has to go beyond the second Tuesday of each month. And this means watching for revisions and monitoring the threat landscape for proof of concepts and exploit releases, as these can greatly change the risk. Now, we at ZDI wanted to do some things to incentivize vendors to do a little bit better, and we considered many options, some of them more serious than others. We considered just zero-daying all the bugs that came in as failed patches. We thought about somehow a wall of shame or some magic quadrant we could push vendors into. We thought about blockchains and NFT. Not really, but somebody probably did in marketing. But what it came down to, in the end, the most reasonable and practical way we could incentivize vendors is to reduce our disclosure timeline for bugs that result from incomplete or faulty patches. And this is one of the few areas where we, as a vendor, as a disclosure wholesaler, can control. We've seen the reduction in timelines work in the past, so we want to use this tactic here as well. Brian will tell you the exact details of that.
Thank you, Dustin. So what we decided to do is reduce our disclosure timelines for bugs that we believe to result from incomplete or faulty patches. And as a reminder, our current disclosure timeline in ZDI is 120 days. And what we wanted to do was actually take a tiered approach on this, depending on the severity of the bug itself and how the failed patch actually worked. So the first tier will be a 30-day timeline. This will be for critical class bugs that are easily circumvented when the patch is released. And in these cases, you can basically consider the patch itself under active attack, since the vendor hasn't disclosed exactly where the bug is, and they have not given enterprises the necessary tools to prevent the exploitation itself. The second tier would be 60 days. This will be for high and critical severity bugs where patches provide at least some level of protection. In these cases, we actually don't detect or expect active exploitation, but again, the risk calculations has changed when this bug is disclosed. And the final tier will be 90 days. Now, these numbers aren't set in stone. I know that some people will say they're literal as 7 days or maybe 90 days for everything else, but this is our starting point for failed patches. We are actively tracking failed patches in the zero-day initiative program, and these timelines can be updated at any time based off of what we're seeing happen across the industry. And we've seen other groups talking about this as well. Most notably, Project Zero reports similar findings of incomplete and variant bugs being used in the wild. And we encourage all organizations who are reporting vulnerabilities to adopt similar timelines for failed patches. We're on track to disclose over 1,700 vulnerabilities this year, so we're going to have plenty of opportunity to gather metrics about this problem and hopefully see improvement as time goes on. But of course, that is a different talk. Now, a case study for this would be CVE 2022-22047, which was that local privilege escalation. If we were to receive that bug today, we would actually reduce the disclosure timeline because of its actual failed patch. Now, some final thoughts just to wrap things up. Incomplete and faulty patches are absolutely being used in the wild by threat actors. This is not an opinion. This is based off of data and things that we're seeing from our competitors. Whether you realize it or not, bad patches are actively being used in the wild, or exploiting in the wild, and it does impact your enterprise. We believe policy adjustments should be based off of real data, and this is how we define our disclosure timelines, and we will edit our timelines based off of this in the future. And you also need to base your risk calculations on that. And finally, yes, I know I'm repeating myself, but I think it's important. Your risk assessment must go beyond the second patch Tuesday and look at the current threat landscape, looking for bugs that are revisions to patches, waiting for proof of concepts to release, and understand that you have to change your approach once those things happen, even after the patch is released. And with that, you can find us online. Dustin?
Please find us online. We got Twitter. At the ZDI Bugs is a new Twitter handle for us. That's tweeting out just advisories that are high CVSS, pwn-to-own, or 0 days. We're on the gram now. My children are thrilled with that. Welcome to 2017. If you find us there. Also, I'll start a patch webcast in September. You can find it on our YouTube. That'll be Patch Wednesday, where I just review stuff real quickly. Hey, we're looking for bugs. If you got bugs to sell, we've got money to buy them. So just here's our PGP CRE. Don't send them clear text email. We can't buy them then.
And as you know now, those patches are faulty sometimes. So definitely reverse engineer those patches and look at what's happening out there.
And maybe there's some cash to find
There's some cash involved.
But hey, look, we're going to go to the wrap-up room. We're right at time. So I want to thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, please join us in South Pacific, South Seas, south of something.
Somewhere.
Just follow us there.
At the
Thank
bar.
you very much.